Welcome again to our Quilts equals Art equals Quilts Artist Talk. I'm Program Director Davana Robedee. I'm joined today by Niraja Lorenz. Niraja has exhibited with us multiple times in our Quilt equals Art equals Quilt exhibit, and she's from Eugene, Oregon. We're really excited to talk to her today. Welcome. Niraja, how are you?
Thank you I'm fine, and thank you so much for having me.
So this year we have sensitive dependence on view. Can you tell us a little bit about that piece?
Certainly. This piece is actually different from a lot of my work in that a lot of the piece is not so detailed piecing. It's got some bigger open spaces. It was, I'd say it was partly inspired by Aboriginal Australian artists and the sense of having a node and connections. And I just started playing with that. So that's that. And the other thing to say about it is the title, sensitive dependence, is a term that comes from chaos theory. And it refers to the fact that a small change, in my case, it might be a change in color or orientation or of the form, can result in wildly different outcomes. So I title a lot of my work out of chaos theory, and that title seemed to apply in this case.
So I've always really liked that about your work. I'm always interested in reading your artist statements. Why chaos theory? What about that is attractive to you?
So my father was involved in chaos theory. And through his work and his influence in my life, I came to see the world as very fluid and dynamic. And while not predictable, also not random. And so I've used a lot of terms from chaos theory because of him and his work, and it seems to apply to my work as well.
Yeah, I love the imagery, and it really sort of works in terms of chaos theory. It's almost like these I would call them galaxy machines in my mind. There's something structural about them, but also celestial. For me, it's at times. And I don't know if you know this, but every year we're not doing them this year, but we usually bring in the local third graders of all the schools and we do tours. And there's a really great photo of me talking to some of the children in the exhibit about one of your pieces.
I've seen that photo. I love it.
The question I was asking them was, there was this big portal type shape, and we were talking about, like, what do you think about this piece? And the question I was asking them is, if you jumped in there, where would you go? And every class had just the best, funnest answers that you could have. And without telling them, before that, I hadn't told them anything about your artist statement, who you were, but they were all in the same line of thinking with your work. They were thinking about science in some way. I just wanted to share that with you.
Oh, thank you. I love hearing that. Yeah. In fact, I recently came upon that photo on your website or someplace, and I said, I got to save this. And so it's a recent photo on my photo roll right now.
Yeah, we'll send you a high-res copy.
Thank you.
But moving from that, one thing that I think makes your work truly remarkable to me is the really beautifully crafted color shifts that you make. And I know that you hand dye a lot of your fabrics, and you have this incredible process. Can you talk a little bit about how a quilt is born?
Certainly. And I can talk about that. I can also show the photos of sensitive dependence as I do that. Would that be a good idea to do that now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So this first photo shows how I begin many of my pieces by making units or sections. In this case here, these are mostly hexagonal units. There's also some square ones and circular ones I see. And at this point, they're probably sewn together into wedges, so the hexagonal ones into sixth, although some of them aren't sewn together at all. And after I've made a bunch, then I will start arranging them and playing with them. And so this here is one of the first arrangements I came up with for this piece. And you can see some familiar units from the earlier piece, but also some that didn't exist. And many of the ones on here won't even go into this piece. In fact, there's one that's in the piece I'm currently working on. So I make things, I try them on, I spend weeks rearranging and playing until I find something that works for me. It's hard to actually talk about how that happens. Here's another version where I started connecting some of the pieces with lines, and I got rid of that blue edge. It's a process that might take weeks. And from there, it went to perhaps here. Let's see, this one. And now here I'm actually sewing together quite a few of the chunks. You can see the upper right section is all put together. So I work on sections at a time. At this point, there's probably very little that's going to change, although I do see some things that did not go into the final version. So I'm still editing and revising as I go. And that's when I first put in this blue bolt that I refer to, or a blue river. After I had the whole top sewn together with the orange-red background, I just felt like it needs blue. And so I pinned that up, and in the end, I added it in as part of the final piece. So it was a process.
Yeah. How did you get to this? Hold on, let's unshare your screen for a moment so we can start.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
How did you come to work this way? Where did you start when you began quilting, as far as like imagery or technique? How did you get in this direction with those specific shapes and this way of working? Did you always work in this exact way?
No, well, I quilted for probably 20 years, just sewing together bits of fabric that I thought were interesting. I didn't follow patterns. I just played with fabric, mostly using printed fabric at that point. About maybe 12, 13 years ago, I started studying with Nancy Crow. And it's at that point that I transitioned into solid colored fabrics. I learned about strip piecing, which I loved doing, and so began incorporating that. But still, I was doing pretty much, I'm going to say, more traditional work. One day, I took a photograph of one of my quilts with a kaleidoscopic lens. So a lens that turned everything into hexagons. And the photograph just astounded me, and it's like, I'm going to make that. I'm going to do that. And so that was the beginning of my Strange Attractor series, which might have been 8 years ago or something like that. And so working with that hexagonal form and working with triangular units that would then fit together started from a photograph.
Wow. That's really fascinating. One thing I will let you explain, I know what strip piecing is. A lot of our quilters know what strip piecing is, but the Schweinfurth actually has a non-quilting audience.
Okay.
Can you tell what the process of strip piecing is? Because I think it's important for people to understand how that works.
Strip piecing is when you basically are making stripes. You sew together, here's an example, you sew together from selvage to selvage a bunch of fabrics. In this case, it's alternating colors, but they can be multiple colors. This is a pile here of things that I've made in the past. Here's one that has a bit of a rainbow in it. And then when I use it, I'll cut a strip off of it. Here's a strip of one. This is all the same fabric that was created by strip piecing. These were another fabric, and so forth. So when I tell people I use strip piecing, I use it, but it's often concealed. This is part of a piece that I'm working, or I've actually finished the top and I'm working on quilting it. This here are sections that are quite densely strip pieced. And if I flip it to the back side, you can see really how many different fabrics and how much fabric is involved. Work that I do like this gets very heavy because there's, for every 1/8 of an inch, there's another, 1/2 inch of fabric that's hiding behind in the seams. And then this is another section. Here's the back side of this black. And it's also a very densely pieced section here of blacks and purples. Not strip pieced, however. This I did using just little scraps.
Well, is there anything else you want to say about specific works, or how you're, what's next? Where do you think this series is going?
Okay. Well, and I could say something about the piece that's behind me.
Yes.
Which is actually part of a different series. It's a series I call Cosmos. Mm-hmm. And this piece I spent a full year working on. It's 10 feet by 7 feet. And it was created to be part of an exhibition that was honoring the 30th anniversary of the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope. So many of the images in here were inspired by photographs from the Hubble. And I worked on this piece for, as I said, it was for about a year, and incorporated all these different things, and then the show got canceled due to COVID. But, if I hadn't have had that, I wouldn't have made it. So I'm really glad that I made it and that I put that much into it. And it's fun to see it.
There is definitely this galaxy look to it.
Right,
And it even has this sort of tie back to Starry Night as well. There's some, maybe it's the color. I can't quite put my finger on what's bringing me there, but.
Well, I used images such as spiral galaxies and nebulas and star clusters and other spatial things that I don't really have a clue what they are. But their images were so inspirational, and I wanted it to look like a night sky. And you can't see it real well in this photo, but the bottom of it has city and forests and mountains and stuff. So it brings you down to earth, and you look up at this huge, vast cosmos. So,
how long do you normally work on a piece? Is a year too much for you, or too little sometimes?
Well, that was the longest I'd ever spent on one piece. I'd say 3 months is probably more representative of a piece that may be 80 inches square, something like that. Again, it really depends on how much piecing is involved and how much of the piecing is already done. I do a lot of things that I make that aren't going to end up in my current piece, and so then I keep them to see if they'll fit into something in the future.
Why don't we go downstairs? Why don't we see what's there?
So this is my studio here. It's the lower level of our home, which is great because I can walk downstairs first thing in the morning and be in my studio. Here's my design wall over here, which was the first thing I made when we moved into this house. On the sides of the wall are a lot of sections and strips and things that I might use in this piece, or I tried to use and didn't work. I have another section of unused pieces also in the back, and actually one finished quilt there. So in the shelving is fabric that goes selvage to selvage. And I use that mostly for strip piecing. So in addition to having a lot of fabric that goes selvage to selvage, I use a lot of scraps. And actually I have friends that mail me scraps. These are large scraps down here that I don't use for strip piecing, but I might use to construct other things. And then I also have bins of tiny scraps that I have sorted by color. And this is where I'm spending a lot of time sitting at my machine. I can move over here to iron, and everything is pretty handy for me. So that's the basics of my studio.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is the hand-dyed fabric. A lot of people who aren't quilters have questions about that, like why do they dye their own fabric, and what does that do? And I can always, it's not that I'm against commercial fabrics. There are certain situations where they're very useful and lovely, but for your work, having that color palette's really important. Can you talk to me about how you got into that and what you're doing with that?
Certainly. Let's take a look at some reds.
Mm-hmm.
So I do buy commercial fabric. I buy both regular commercial fabric as well as from a place called Cherrywood that is sort of hand-dyed commercial fabric. And the fabric I like is a very dense weave. I use Pimatex primarily, which allows me to make very thin lines without it fraying too much. A lot of commercial fabrics are pretty densely woven, and if you cut an 1/8 of an inch line, you'll have 2 threads in it. Can't do much. When you hand dye fabrics, you can get, can you see that? The mottledness in there. You can also get really solid colors, but you can get a real variety. It's not just one red. So I have dozens of reds, and not only are there fabrics that I've dyed, I buy hand dyed from other people I know, and I get scraps of hand dyed from people. So when I want to have a section that's red, I can have it be made out of 100 different reds, which to me is what the world really looks like. It doesn't look like a solid block of red. It looks like multiple reds. It is time consuming. It's very labor intensive. It's better to do when the weather's warm, so it's more of a summer activity for me. And it's fun. You also can create really amazing things. So you can get stuff like that, which I might at some point, want to cut just a section out of this. One technique that I've used in the hand dyeing is what's called shibori dyeing. And that's where you actually stitch the fabric before you dye it. I don't know if you can see this texture in this blue here. And there's also in this pale blue. So this was dyed with a technique that allows the dye to soak in more in certain areas. And it gives you a really intense texture to it. This little orange piece here, as well as this, is also a shibori technique where you stitch, whereas the rest of that piece was hand dyed in what I call scrunch dyeing. You basically stuff a yard of fabric into a gallon Ziploc baggie and pour the dye in. That's the quick and easy version. You can also tie dye, which I haven't ever used something like that in a piece, but I have used a lot of fabric like this that's really multiple toned, and it's got to be very random and unpredictable what's going to come out from a dye like that. But I used a lot of that in my large Cosmos piece, where to me it just does look very much like the galaxy in space.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you guys want to see more of her work, you can visit her website, and also please come visit the exhibit before we close on January 10th. Thank you so much for inviting us into your studio today, and we'll hopefully see you next year.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you all. I look forward to seeing what comes of it.